They shall be my sons, and in them will live the hopes of a unified humanity. Theirs will be the strength to prevail, not only when victory lies within easy reach, but even when it seems unattainable, when doom settles like a shroud all about. In those times of darkness, my noble sons will shine the brightest of all.
The Primarchs were the 20 genetically engineered transhuman sons of the Emperor of Mankind, created in the late 30th millennium. They were intended to be the immortal and superhuman generals and proconsuls who would command the Emperor's great crusade to reunite the scattered human race beneath his leadership. Their genomes later served as the genetic templates from which the Emperor crafted his 20 Space Marine legions. The Primarchs were bred to be perfect generals, warriors, and statesmen, larger, stronger, faster, and smarter than any normal human could ever hope to be. They possessed a potent charisma and martial prowess that made them like the mythical gods of old, untouchable by disease, old age, or supposedly the petty failings of lesser men. Each embodied an aspect of war. One was the greatest strategist ever known, another the personification of the terror of war, a third the master of psychic powers, a fourth the greatest practitioner of the arts of fortification, and so on. The Primarchs were the Emperor's answer to reclaiming all the lost worlds of mankind and welcoming them into his new imperium. The Emperor intended to raise his sons to be the best military commanders and political leaders in human history. They would bring the imperial truth to the rest of the human-settled galaxy in their father's name, serving as his generals and proconsuls. But the Chaos Gods intervened to foil their great adversaries' plans, and the Primarchs were sprited away through the warp to other human-settled planets of the galaxy. Deprived of the Emperor's care and guidance, each developed a personality uniquely shaped and sometimes damaged by the difficult circumstances of their homeworlds. Yet for all their gifts, the Primarchs were still only men, and in the end their all-too-human flaws would become the primary obstacle to the realization of the Emperor's great dream for mankind. History. Primarch Project. The massive scientific effort to create the Primarchs before the start of the Unification Wars in the 30th millennium was known as the Primarch Project. It is unknown exactly when the project began, but Perturabo would later estimate his own birth to be the year 792, and 30, which gives an approximate date for the project's end, though he was referring to his arrival on Olympia. The means by which the Emperor crafted 20 individual superhuman genomes using his own arcane perpetual genetic code as the base without resorting to the use of cloning is unknown to present imperial science. There was a two-stage process involved. First, the Emperor extracted a subset of his own DNA to act as the foundation for a pure, undifferentiated Primarch gene stock template. The pure Primarch gene stock was then further differentiated into the 20 separate genetic templates that would serve as the individual Primarch's genomes. The data concerning the original engineering of the individual Primarch strands was later analyzed by a Raven Guard apothecary and a Magos Genitor of the Mechanicum during the Horus Heresy. They discovered that certain of the individual Primarch samples had gene sequences deliberately deleted from the base, pure Primarch genome, while other samples showed the addition of clearly non-human DNA. Intriguingly, the genome of the Primarch listed as subject Figai had added canine-like DNA. Although it is not clear whether the sample numbers corresponded to the actual Primarchs of the Space Marine legions of the same number, this could explain the wolf-like affinity of Lim Russ and the unexpected feral mutation of many space wolves Astartes into the Wolfen. It is believed by modern imperial scholars that there was more than just physical manipulation of the genetics involved in the creation of the Primarchs, and that the Emperor called upon many techniques of psychic sorcery derived from the warp to shape the extraordinary abilities and unnatural charisma of his transhuman gene sons. It is also now known that sometime during the Age of Technology, the man who would become the Emperor had traveled with several of his fellow perpetuals, including Olivia Sharika, to the world of Molech, a night world only a few light years distant from Terra, in a one-way spacecraft. Sharika watched as the Emperor entered a secret warp gate present on Molech, where he bargained with the powers of the Immaterium to gain new abilities and knowledge, including most likely the techniques needed to create the Primarchs. Shurika was later tasked by the Emperor with remaining on Molech to guard the warp gate and keep others from using it until his armies returned millennia later to conquer it for the nascent Imperium of Man during the early days of the Great Crusade. The Emperor's use of this knowledge meant that the Primarchs were intended to be spiritually as well as physically engineered, and may explain why they possessed so much personal magnetism and charisma beyond what even their enhanced genetics would predict. But such arcane techniques also meant that the Primarchs were unusually vulnerable to the effects of chaos, since their souls would shine so brightly in the immaterium and draw the attention of daemonic entities like moths to a candle flame. This is why the Emperor carefully inscribed arcane glyphs of protection on the Primarchs' gestation capsules and crafted the most powerful Jella field ever made around the Gene Vault deep beneath the Imperial Palace in the Himalayan mountains where they were created. Unfortunately, this protection proved insufficient, for the Chaos Gods learned of the Emperor's plans and the existence of the Primarch Project. They decided they had no wish to see his attempt to weaken their power succeed by extending his new order of reason and scientific progress across the human-settled worlds of the galaxy. Scattering of the Primarchs. The ruinous powers of chaos somehow spirited the Emperor's unborn superhuman children away through the warp in Ka. 792. And 30 from the gene laboratories of what would become the Imperial Dungeons of the Imperial Palace. A massive localized warp rift was created within the gene vaults of the palace, deep under the Himalayan mountains on Terra where the Primarchs were gestating. The gestation capsules containing the Emperor's unborn sons were scattered through the warp to human colony planets long since lost to mankind during the Age of Strife. It may have been at this time, when first touched by the hand of chaos, that the first seeds of corruption were laid in the breasts of those Primarchs who would eventually turn traitor to the Emperor and his Imperium. Whether the Emperor was able to effect this outcome is unsure, but every Primarch landed on ancient worlds of humanity, planets long since lost to the light of the greater universe beyond the stars. This was a massive setback to the Emperor's plans. He had counted on his superhuman generals to lead his army of conquest out from Terra. Without them, his plans, so many millennia in the making, rested on a knife's edge. He needed an edge, something to give mankind an advantage as they struck out against a very hostile galaxy once more. Despite this terrible setback, the Emperor was nothing if not adaptive, and he decided to move forward without the Primarchs. He and the scientists of the Imperial Biotechnical Division had already used the samples of genetic material from each of his Primarchs to craft the first Astartes gene seeds solar decades before, stem cell zygotes from which had been cultured genetically engineered organs that, when implanted within a normal adolescent human male host, would allow that man to take on many of the physical and mental properties possessed by each Primarch. The Emperor had implanted these organs into the bravest, strongest, and best young human warriors identified among his armies, whom he intended to stand by his side as the vanguard of the Great Crusade. Thus were born the Legiones Astartes, the Space Marines, and they would reconquer the galaxy for humanity at the command of the Master of Mankind, even without the initial leadership of their Primarchs. Although an Astartes warrior was but a pale copy of his Primarch gene sire, the technique of implanting human beings with extra organs allowed for a certain degree of mass production, and where the Emperor's 20 superhuman sons had been centuries in the making, thousands of Astartes could now be engineered and trained in the matter of a single Terran decade. These techniques provided the Emperor with the required numbers of transhuman warriors to successfully launch the Great Crusade in 798 and 30. It should be noted that Adeptus Custode's genetic modifications, which are apparently derived in part from the undifferentiated Primarch gene stock, is more complex than base Astartes gene seed, as it contains 12 more elements. The source of custodian genetics, being only one step removed from the actual DNA of the Emperor himself, may explain the Custode's extremely heightened sense of kinship with the Emperor. However, the custodian genetic code is still far simpler than each of the individual Primarch genomes, even though all were derived from the same source, the undifferentiated, pure Primarch gene stock template. Rediscovery of the Primarchs. As the new interstellar human empire expanded during the Great Crusade, the Emperor used his powerful gifts of psychic foresight and precognition to track down his wayward sons scattered across the galaxy and reunite them with their respective space marine legions. Each Primarch was both a father and older brother to each legion's Astartes, the source of that legion's temperament and humors, a being in which each legion saw its ultimate perfection and ways of war given personification. The return of the Primarchs to their legions marked the height of the Great Crusade. First thousands and then hundreds of thousands of human-settled worlds fell to imperial compliance, their conquest carried out by the newly reunited Primarchs and their space marine legions. Like the gods of mythic Terran legend, the Primarchs strode the battlefields of the galaxy, and their power proved irresistible. Yet the Primarchs, for all their expressed superiority and seeming immortality, were still men, and they possessed too many of the same human flaws that have bedeviled mankind since the birth of the species. They proved jealous and arrogant, highly competitive, and all too willing to hold grudges against one another and even their father the Emperor. Whether these flaws were the result of their exposure to the corrupting power of chaos as infants, or were simply the natural human flaws that could not be excised even from the progeny of the Emperor, is unknown. Yet ultimately, it was the Primarch's flaws that doomed the Imperium to the nightmare of the Horus heresy and 10,000 standard years of stagnation, decay, repression, and endless war. After the Primarch Angron's rediscovery, the Emperor noted that he had been altered by the cerebral cybernetic modifications known as the Butcher's Nails that had been implanted in his mind by the gladiatorial slave lords of his homeworld of Museria. The great Mechanicum techno-archaeologist Archenland aided the Emperor in investigating the nature of this terrible technology intended to increase aggression and rage, which was slowly killing Angron. In the course of the tech priest's investigation, the Emperor explained to Land that, in truth, he had no emotional attachment to the Primarchs because they were simply created to serve mankind as tools and weapons. When asked why the Emperor had allowed the Primarchs to call him father, although he professed to feel no such filial attachment, the Emperor told the ancient story of the puppet named Pinocchio who had sought to become a real boy. He explained that it was only natural for any creation to refer to its creator as father. Horus Heresy. The Primarch Sanguinius of the Blood Angels Legion, after killing a daemon during the Horus Heresy. At the height of the Great Crusade, the Imperial Warmaster Horus fell to the temptations of chaos and convinced 8 of his fellow brother Primarchs to rebel against the Emperor and follow him in his attempt to supplant the Master of Mankind. During the Horus Heresy, brother fought brother as the fallen Primarchs led their traitor legions against their former comrades who remained loyal. Horus himself fought the Blood Angels Primarch Sanguinius and the Emperor during the final battle of the Great Interstellar Civil War. At the height of the final confrontation during the Siege of Terra, above the surface of Terra on Horus' own flagship, the Gloriana-class battleship Vengeful Spirit, the Emperor clashed with the Warmaster. The Emperor was reluctant to use his full psychic power against his most beloved son, and it was not until Horus had mortally crippled the Emperor and killed Sanguinius that the Emperor finally unleashed the full extent of his unimaginable psychic powers. He finally brought the Warmaster down and eradicated even his soul from the warp, so that the ruinous powers could not restore their puppet to some semblance of horrid life. Most of the remaining traitor legions fled into the Eye of Terror following Horus' defeat, and their Primarchs would sell their souls to chaos, becoming daemon princes, each ruling a small chaos empire within the corrupted realms of the Eye of Terror. Loyalist Primarchs. Today, all but one of the Primarchs are either damned in servitude to the gods of chaos, lost to current knowledge of their whereabouts, or dead. As mentioned before, Sanguinius died at the hands of his beloved brother Horus during the Siege of Terra, who in turn later died at the hands of his father, the Emperor. Ferrus Manus, Primarch of the Iron Hands, died on Istvan V at the start of the Horus Heresy during the Dropsite Massacre. He was killed by his most beloved brother and best friend, the Primarch Fulgrim, who wielded the Blade of the Lair, a demonically possessed weapon that corrupted his mind to chaos and later possessed him. This greater daemon of Slaanesh resided within Fulgrim's form for a time until the Primarch reasserted his dominance and regained control of his body. Rumors abound that Ferrus Manus may currently still be alive on Mars, as his body was restored to a semblance of life through the cybernetic assistance of the Adeptus Mechanicus. However, the Mechanicus and the Iron Hands chapter both fervently deny this speculation. Over the next 1,000 Terran years, the other remaining Loyalist Primarchs died or disappeared one by one. Lion L. Johnson of the Dark Angels returned to his homeworld of Caliban to find it in ruins, and the Dark Angel Space Marines he had left to garrison it were corrupted by the bitter fallen angel Luther to rebellion. He led a strike force of his own Space Marines against the traitors on the surface, fighting with a burning hate towards his lost sons. The planet was heavily bombarded, drastically weakening it, so that when the Chaos Gods realized they had failed to claim the Lion, they unleashed a warp storm of massive power and size. All that was left of Caliban's surface was the Tower of Angels and the Rock. The Dark Angels form a stronghold, with the rest being either destroyed or sucked into the warp. When the Dark Angel Astartes got to the Tower of Angels, all they found was the unconscious body of Luther. The Lion was nowhere to be found. But some say that he is still asleep inside the rock, the floating remains of Caliban turned into a mobile fortress monastery, with the Watchers in the Dark who are healing his injuries. Some Dark Angel Astartes say that he will return one day to lead them again. This would explain why Cypher, the fallen angel who has avoided capture time and again, has a special sword with him that he does not use in combat. This blade may be the Lion's own sword, amongst other possibilities, and the truth of its origins would be one of the first questions the Dark Angels would love to ask the most elusive of their fallen brothers. Jagatai Khan of the White Scars disappeared through a Drukhari Wedway portal whilst he was pursuing those savage Xenos after a raid on the White Scars homeworld. Rumors abound that he was captured whilst lost in the twisting parts of the Drukhari section of the Wedway. Lennon Russ of the Space Wolves is one of the Primarchs whose disappearance appears to be voluntary. The Space Wolves hold a legend that says Rust went on a quest to find a means to cure the Emperor with the fruit from the mystical Tree of Life, but the truth is likely to be far more complex. Others have said that Rust traveled into the Eye of Terror to lead his lost 13th Company against Magnus the Red and the Thousand Sons Trader Legion. Still other legends hold that Rust was dying and that he shall return when the Imperium most needs him, the period called the Wolf Time, to lead the Wolves of Fenris once more. Rogel Dawn of the Imperial Fists apparently died fighting on the bridge of the Chaos despoiler-classed battleship Sword of Sacrilege alongside a company of his sons after he led a contingent of Imperial Fists in an attack on the massed armada of the First Black Crusade in the late 31st millennium with a vastly outnumbered force. He had launched the hopeless assault in the hopes of delaying the Chaos offensive upon the Imperium until reinforcements could arrive. Dawn was one of the last Primarchs to die after the end of the Horus heresy. His skeletal remains, weapons, and power armor were believed recovered from the wreck, even as most of the rest of the Chaos starship was destroyed during the conflict. In the 41st millennium, Dawn's skeletal fists have been separated from the rest of his remains and are housed in the holiest shrine of the Imperial Fists chapter on board their mobile fortress monastery the Phalanx, preserved in stasis for all time and inscribed with the names of every Imperial Fists chapter master to have led the Sons of Dawn since his death. Only a chapter master has the right to inscribe his name and heraldry upon their sacred bones. At the same time, Dawn's skeletal corpse, without the hands, was also placed by the Imperial Fists within another chapel on the Phalanx, embedded within a block of clear amber that has been contoured to match the body's form. Robert Gilliman of the Ultramarines nearly met his end slowly after fighting his former brother Fulgrim of the Emperor's Children Trader Legion during the Battle of Thessala in 121 and 31. He was mortally wounded following a slash across his throat with a corrupted Chaos blade which later poisoned him, the legendary Kinnibrek Anatame that nearly killed his brother Horus on the plague moon of Davin. For 10,000 standard years, Gilliman's body lay at the heart of the Ultramarines' Temple of Correction on Macragge, maintained in a stasis field to preserve it. He was the only Loyalist Primarch to still exist, in some physical sense, in the entire Imperium. His sons and billions of pilgrims every Terran year were able to experience the awe-inspiring sight of one of the Emperor's own sons, the bleeding wounds he sustained still visible upon his neck and chest. Legend among the Ultramarines long held that his wound was slowly healing, in spite of the impossibility of such a thing while in stasis. Guilliman was revived again after the fall of Cadia in the 13th Black Crusade during the Ultramar campaign of 999 and 41. Currently, Guilliman serves once more as Imperial Regent and Lord Commander of the Imperium, as he did in the years immediately after the Horus heresy. The resurrected Primarch led the Indomitus Crusade in an attempt to throw back the forces of Chaos and the Xenos threats to the Imperium. There is little known about how Vulcan of the Salamanders disappeared. He vanished into thin air around 1,000 years after the Horus heresy. Some claim that he died on Istvan V. However, he was later present at the Imperial Palace when Guilliman divided the Space Marine Legions into chapters during the Second Founding. The Salamanders chapter believes that after one of their number finds all 9 relics that Vulcan left scattered around the galaxy for them to find, Vulcan will return to lead the Salamanders to victory against the traitor legions of Chaos and gain vengeance for the terrible slaughter suffered by the chapter at Istvan V during the Dropsite massacre. In truth, Vulcan is a perpetual like the Emperor, one of a strange group of human mutants who possess the ability to be resurrected no matter how many times they are slain, and Vulcan has faced the Reaper many times over the last 10,000 Terran years. Corvus Corax of the Raven Guard was tainted by guilt and shame following the end of the Horus heresy. In order to rebuild the strength of his gene sons from the devastation of the Dropsite massacre on Istvan V, Corax sought to accelerate the growth of his legion's gene seed organs by obtaining a sample of the pure Primarch DNA from Terra that the Emperor had used to create his sons. The Emperor allowed Corax to carry out this mission, and the needed genetic material was obtained, but infiltrators within the Raven Guard from the Alpha Legion used a daemonic essence to taint the Primarch DNA, causing many Raven Guard aspirants to become hulking mutants. Filled with despair and shame at this outcome, Corax personally gave each degenerated battle brother the Emperor's piece. Riddled with guilt over what he had done to save his legion, Corax locked himself away within his sanctum, the Raven's Tower, for a standard year. On the anniversary date of his self-imposed exile, he left his tower, haggard and gaunt, and took a small shuttlecraft. It was last monitored as setting a course for the Eye of Terror, the realm of the Chaos Gods. He left only a single word as his legacy, nevermore. Corax was later mutated by the energies of the warp into a creature composed entirely of shadow, who is now hunting the Wordbearers and the Daemon Primarch Lorga within the Eye of Terror. Of all the Primarchs, excepting those missing, the resurrected Robert Guilliman, the mutated Corvus Corax, and the slowly awakening Lion L. Johnson, only the damned Primarchs of Chaos live today, although their bodies, minds, and souls have been completely consumed by the power of the Dark Gods. Lost Primarchs. Almost nothing is known about the 2 unknown Lost Primarchs. References to the 2nd and 11th Primarchs are made in the short story, The Lightning Tower, in which Rogel Dawn explains that the plinths on which their statues stand in the Imperial Palace should be vacant, and says that no one ever spoke of those 2 absent brothers. Their separate tragedies had seemed like aberrations. Had they, in fact, been warnings that no one had heeded? The traitor Primarch statues in this story are covered with a shroud, so the fate of the 2nd and 11th is undetermined. They may have been found and a tragedy befell them, as the story implies they were spoken about posthumously. During a conversation between Magnus the Red and Lorga, it is mentioned that both Horus and Fulgrim upheld an oath taken never to speak again of the 2 lost brothers. As for the fates of those Primarch's Space Marine Legions, the Ironed Legion and the Exith Legion, speculation by the Wordbearers on rumors of a sudden swell in the Ultramarines' recruitment numbers following the decision to remove the 2 Primarchs from the Imperial record may indicate that some of the Lost Legion's Astartes were integrated into the remaining Space Marine Legions.
While the Emperor had walked abroad, he had cloaked his manipulations in love. He had let his Primarchs call him father. He had let them call themselves his sons. He had rarely spoken those words himself. Guilliman now realized and when he had done so without sincerity. Buffeted by the full might of the emperor's will, unclothed in flesh, a cloak had been ripped from Guilliman's eyes. The emperor had allowed them to love him, and to believe he loved them in return. He had not. His Primarchs were weapons. That was all.